As a young girl, Pat Nixon dreamed of traveling the world. As the wife of the Vice President and the President of the United States, her dream was realized. She visited more than 80 countries, earning her the title America's Ambassador of Goodwill.
They did an awful lot of traveling for the Eisenhowers because Mamie didn't like to fly, and President Eisenhower had some health problems. And early on in that administration, Eisenhower just dubbed Pat Nixon and Richard Nixon as his Goodwill ambassadors and said, go forth.
Mrs. Nixon's warmth, grace, and dignity won friends and admirers not just for herself, but also for her country.
She was loved by everybody she visited, whether it was in Ghana or South America or wherever she went. People really allied with her and identified with her willingness to meet them with a friendly smile, not imposing any ideas of grandeur or anything else. Certainly not royalty, just one of the people.
And she was a true diplomat. One of the great things I remember her doing is in Ghana, and we were visiting a school, and I was standing next to Helen Thomas, and she's got a notepad and she's chewing gum as she always does. And Mrs. Nixon came into the playground, and the kids looked at her and saw her smile and saw her eyes light up, and they flocked to her. And they were touching and grabbing, and she just was hugging them. And Helen Thomas says, the kids always know who a good person is.
Pat Nixon was the first Lady to visit Africa, and the first to represent the President of the United States at an official state event overseas.
The President's popularity being so high that President was getting a lot of invitations to go overseas. One was President Tolbert of Liberia, the inauguration. At that time, of course, he couldn't go over, but he sent his best representative, which was Mrs. Nixon.
She was invited to visit the farmer's market. Immediately, we were both sort of staggered by the odor of rotting fish and vegetables. And there were a few rats, some of them dead, some of them scurrying around. But she never fazed her. She went through like she was going through Saks of Fifth Avenue.
Mrs. Nixon understood and respected other cultures, and she always looked for opportunities to embrace the great diversity that makes the world such a fascinating place.
On top of the building that the hotel or the residence where we were staying, and the people were all up there, the Liberians, the President, they got her up. And then all of a sudden, several women came over to her with these robes and wrapped it around her. Then she started dancing with them. It's amazing, you know, the stamina that she had.
Mrs. Nixon's stamina and energy seemed inexhaustible as she traveled from one country to another, attending one event after another. But on a memorable trip to South America in 1958, even her courage was tested, and she rose to the occasion magnificently.
We had to pass under two balconies, which were loaded with people who were loaded with saliva. While we were just crossing under the first one, the band struck up the Venezuelan national anthem, so we had to stand there and take it. And believe me, we took it.
Enduring vicious insults and showers of spit from the crowd above, Mrs. Nixon stood at attention with the Vice President as the Venezuelan and American national anthems were played. Little did they know as they drove away from the airport that danger was just a few miles away.
As we proceeded down through this hostile crowd on both sides of the street, people again throwing rocks. They tore the flags off the car, broken windows, and covered with spit and anything else that would stick to the car. By this time, the foreign minister's wife is in hysterics.
In the face of extreme danger, Mrs. Nixon maintained her poise, exhibiting true American courage.
She had her arm around her and was trying to hold her down and control her and see if she could, quiet her down.
She was comforting her?
Yeah.
Mrs. Nixon's personal courage was tested again as First Lady when she visited South Vietnam in 1969 and went into the field to comfort wounded soldiers. This made her the first First Lady to visit an active combat zone.
To visit, or do you have some larger purpose in mind, some project?
No, actually, I've visited over 60 countries with my husband in the past, and I've always gone to visit the children and the people of the countries because I want to spend goodwill and friendship and tell them how much the people in the United States are thinking of them.
A year later, Peru was struck with a devastating earthquake. Immediately, Mrs. Nixon wanted to try to help. As America's ambassador of Goodwill, Pat Nixon put America's best foot forward everywhere she went.
We flew up to the site in Haraz. As we went up, she could see Yungay, the city just north of Haraz. It was the place where almost everybody died. Out of 20,000 people, only 400 survived.
And the interesting thing to me on that trip was the wife of the president of Peru. Really a very pretty woman who was well versed in how to behave like a First Lady Latin American style. And here comes this blonde, energetic, slender, later says, I want to see some of these people who have really had it. Oh, well, we can't really go there. That's not quite what, that's where we're going. And Mrs. Velasco went along with her and watched for about 20 to 30 minutes as Mrs. Nixon would hug some of the Indian people in the high mountains where they went, or cuddle some of the children, or inquire about how they were doing and what did they need. And she'd turn to one of the military aides who might have been with her at the time and said, make sure these people get such and such. It's on the big plane. It's not on the plane that we're on. And it took Mrs. Velasco about 30 minutes. And then she got it. Then she started going around and touching and hugging and feeling. And the two of them together, the brunette and the blonde, it was a fascinating experience in watching this one First Lady learn the other First Lady techniques.
The general that I was arguing with over security of the helicopter came to me and said that nothing that the U.S. could have done did more good in getting the communists out of Peru than her trip down there. She's so willing to do things, doing things that help people, that help our people too, not only on, abroad, but she's so wonderful. I've traveled with her here in the United States as well, and the reception that she received was gratifying. It's just that people just loved her.